Hello potential viewers, welcome to my channel. No overly serious video for this week. I figure I can occasionally dive into slightly more entertaining topics and do a review of a Netflix series. And since I don't have a taste for obvious YA stuff, like The Kissing Booth and Cursed, nor am I a fan of reality shows like Too Hot to Handle, so I decided to talk about something I actually watched and kind of enjoyed. Feel free to call me Mr. Late again. But the series I would like to talk about today was Wu Assassin, aired on Netflix on August 2019. Now, if you are watching this video, you probably have watched it already, and if you did, good. Hope what I will say may be of interest to you, at least for a little bit. And if you have not watched it already, then I hope I can provide you with enough information to help you make a conscious decision on whether you would want to spend your precious time on this series. Oh, since I'm about to talk about some key plot points, so spoiler alert. So the story basically features a young chef named Kaijin who was mysteriously chosen by an ancient spirit named Ying Ying as the next Wu assassin, who is responsible for assassinating the Wu Lord. And if you want to ask me, as a Chinese cultural expert, what are the Wu Lords? Then my answer to you would be, I have no freaking idea. Yeah, so first, Wu does not seem to mean anything here. In Mandarin Chinese, it just means five. I'm not sure what it meant in Cantonese, but sure does not mean what it's supposed to mean in this context. From the context of the show, it seemed that Wu stood for the Chinese version of mythical elements, similar to the classical elements in Western mythos: fire, water, air, and earth. The Chinese version is metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. One Wu is just one element, and the Wu Lords are basically the Chinese version of the elementals, or elemental lord. I am not entirely happy with the translation, mainly because one of its directors was Stephen Feng, someone who is supposedly familiar with Chinese culture and classic Hong Kong movies. But besides my gripe with the name Wu Assassin, the series got the elementals right, namely their basic presentation and their basic symbolism in the Chinese culture. The overall cultural tone of the series was also pretty well balanced. It has a decent Chinese culture-inspired lore behind it, and not too obscure as to scare away people who are not familiar with the ancient and Chinese culture, but also has a fitting modern city feeling as it is set in San Francisco, and it conveyed an okay sense of modern crime mystery / gang drama. It definitely showed more respect for the elements displayed when it involved Chinese and ancient culture than a lot of the shows that supposedly have Chinese cultural elements, so I can give the series credit on this. Another feature of the series worthy of praise is the action design and choreography with the inclusion of these elemental powers in fight scenes. For a few key fights that involve a lot of use of supernatural powers, the actions are clearly well directed, and one can tell that the actors are portraying characters that have long adapted their superpowers into their fighting styles. There was very little awkward stops and pauses between fighting with Kung Fu and conjuring superpower energy to blast your enemies. You see, for characters with supernatural powers and engaging a lot of fighting, it will be completely natural for them to hone their skills enough so that they won't have too obvious tells before using their powers so they can have the element of surprise when fighting their enemies. Yet, the whole announcing my awesome power before releasing it trope is just way too common in current cinema and TV, so I can give the series that. In fact, it was a good display of the director's understanding of the traditional Hong Kong and Chinese wuxia and martial arts movies and TV. The using of supernatural power is a part of one's skill in combat, not some new toy a character is not familiar with. The plot is mostly just right in terms of complexity. It did not try to be overly complex, and is mostly relatively self-aware. It has several turns of events that is not too obvious to keep the plot from becoming totally predictable and boring, but is not overtly convoluted and self-important either. But the story can get a bit dry sometimes. You can feel that sometimes the writer / director might just be making things up on the spot so that they can just push the poorly set up plot points so that the characters can act in a certain way. One particular bad example of this was the establishment of some of the core premises that the Wu Lords need to be annihilated to prevent them from uniting and destroying the world. And since the series is based on a modern setting, warlords and empires are no longer feasible enemies, so gangs and cartels are the next best thing. However, the issue of gangs and cartels with this series and its semi-realistic settings in the San Francisco is that they never formed as much of a world-scale threat as the series tried to portray them to be. What also does not help was that the series was a bit too serious and not self-aware enough on this premise. It gave you the feeling that it was aspiring to go for a Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings vibe in a modern setting, but does not have the budget nor creative power behind it to support that. And I can surely understand how this failed. A well-balanced combination of mythical world and a modern world is a hard artistic topic to explore. I can't say I have seen any good movies/TV series that have done it right. The best representation of this kind of fantasy art still live mostly in novels, comics, and mangas. The MCU sort of got it right, but it's one exception, not a rule. And finally, what would be a Netflix series review if I don't address the guaranteed woke scenes from the series? And if you think because this is a mythical/modern crime series with ancient kung fu and elemental magic powers, there wouldn't be much room for shoved-in woke scenes, you'd be correct. But it would not stop Netflix from attempting it, right? One easiest sign to spot is the female cop played by Catherine Winnick. There was one scene where she, as a quote-unquote independent strong woman, scolds the arrogant male police on how she has a bigger dick than he did. One of those classic throwaway scenes to set up a strong female character, nothing out of the ordinary nor particularly annoying. But there is indeed a scene that stirred up some debate in the so-called Asian community, which actually annoyed the hell out of me. It is a scene where our protagonist, Kai Jin, and one of his former enemies, with whom he has a complicated relationship, were eating at a diner in an apparently majority white area. The waitress, who is a middle-aged white lady, seeing that our two characters in the scene were Chinese, asked them if they would like the kitchen to prepare anything special for them, since they were obviously not from around here. The former enemy of the protagonist, somehow triggered by this kind of well-intentioned gesture, started giving a lesson to the waitress about how Chinese people have been in the US for quite long and spilled out a history lecture about Chinese Americans, intending to re-educate this ignorant white lady. Then the argument escalated, and our protagonist and his new ally kicked every white person's butt in the diner. So first of all, if the waitress was indeed super racist, why would she ask our Chinese protagonist and his Chinese companion if they need anything special prepared? Why not just give them a hard time or neglect their orders? Why would you even give a shit about whether their white food suit their appetite? If this is a scene intended to portray ignorance, why would being a snooty know-it-all lecturer help the situation? Why would being rude and unforgiving to someone who displayed a little kindness out of ignorance a good behavior on your part? Are you so entitled and fragile that everyone should know your history? As far as I can tell, this scene was intended to pander to the so-called Asian American and Chinese American community, and it just gave me the major cringe and helped fuel my distaste for this so-called community. So let me conjure my inner Biden and say this. If this scene did not make you cringe and at least a little bit annoyed, you ain't Asian. You are just a woke-ass entitled American brat who happens to have Asian skin. Get your trigger banana ass out of here. Okay, rant over. So all in all, what would be my overall ratings for this series? B+ for basic cultural elements. It was far from great, but it was decent. C+ for plot. The scale of the story should be scaled back a bit. Not everything should revolve around saving the world. Sometimes preventing evil capable of decimating normal people's lives is a good enough plot point. F for wokeness. But luckily, there was not too much of it. It was annoying but tolerable, kind of what you would expect from a Netflix series. That will be all for my video today. Hope you like it. Hope to see you next time.